They want to know the brewers behind the label, a beer's reason for being, and most importantly, they really want to feel connected to the brand on a level that extends far beyond the actual beer itself. So while an eye-catching label might help a six-pack stand out, it's the compelling story behind a brand that will keep a consumer coming back time and time again. So as an expert storyteller, if any of you guys have ever visited Good Beer Hunting, you know that Michael Kiser has really built himself a reputation and a career by helping beverage companies understand who they are and bring their brands to life in a way that resonates with today's consumer. He's served clients as large as Nike and Miller Coors, and as small as some of the breweries he'll talk about today, but Solemn Oath. And he's really developed a knack for helping these brewers find their voice. So over the next 30 minutes, Michael's going to guide us through some of his principles for effective storytelling and share a few case studies of some brands that have turned to him for help in finding their own voice. So Michael, come on up and take it away. There's your clicker.
Thank you. So hi, I'm Michael Kiser of Good Beer Hunting. I'm going to try and describe briefly to you what Good Beer Hunting is. It's kind of a gnarly story, but it's kind of two sides to it. There's a .com side. It's a website devoted to deep, beautiful, kind of the highest level of storytelling that we could manage to do around craft brewers. It's also, as Chris mentioned, sort of a consultancy agency collaboration kind of a wing to it, where we work with breweries and other craft-oriented companies to develop brand and portfolio and product strategies. And because the reason why I do that is because that's sort of where I came from. I used to work at an innovation agency. I used to lead large-scale sort of strategic platforms for companies like Nike and HP and Samsung, mostly internally, trying to pitch in new ideas and help them understand how they can rally an organization around a new idea and roll that out through the company and ultimately to the marketplace with great success. Hopefully something that gets recognition, resonates with people, and hopefully reveals something kind of new in terms of product or service or brand. I became obsessed with beer about 8 years ago, somewhere along those lines. Started writing about beer on my own time, became very passionate. That's where the .com side kind of came from. And along those ways, I started paying attention to how brewers were working and presenting themselves and telling their own stories. And mostly, this is what I saw. I saw the end of a story before I ever saw the beginning of a story, because brewers are still, to this day, convinced that the only thing that matters is in the bottle. And I don't argue with them. Certainly that's the only thing that matters to a lot of folks, especially if you're the one making that thing. You can't argue with that. But if you want to sell that beer, other things matter. So why doesn't the quality speak for itself? Why doesn't the beer speak for itself all of the time? It's because beer isn't necessarily the story in and of itself, it's the embodiment of a story. If you think about a book on a shelf, we look at the cover first, we read the content later, and then if it really, really resonates with us, it matters to us. That's at the point when something really matters. But right now, we kind of fetishize the medium, and we forget the message, right? We tell people not to judge a book by its cover, and yet that's exactly what we're mostly asking our consumers in beer to do every single day, because before they get to the shelf, we haven't told them a single thing. So for me, before we get to the end of a story, we have to back up all the way to the beginning, the once upon a time. That's where a story begins. The beer is the end. The story begins with once upon a time. And there's this huge gap in the middle where the story actually has to fit, right? So what's in that gap? Well, we're going to get to the components of it, but this is what it looks like to a consumer. This is where all the stories hide. They hide between the first page and the last page, and then they hide on a shelf. And this is what it looks like in a beer store, if we're lucky. So how does a consumer ever find the beer that they're looking for, based on shelf presence alone? Well, sometimes they know who their favorite author is. They know the topic of interest that they like. Maybe they're just looking for something popular and new and exciting. Same thing happens with beer. We look at our favorite breweries. Maybe they're local, maybe they're national, maybe they're just, it's what our dad drank, it's what our friends drink. They look for specific styles. We heard a lot today about what styles really push in the marketplace. Everybody's looking for IPA. Or we look to the crowd, right? The wisdom of social media in some ways. What should I be drinking? We're happy to turn that over to other people's opinions. So when we confront a shelf like this, we hope to have some sort of strategy for finding what we want, but ultimately, this is what most beer stores look like to a consumer that's not that adept at finding what they're looking for. Rate beer consumers, that's not everybody. right? Not everybody's looking at ratings, not everybody's trying to track what's interesting or new, not everybody's reading websites like my own. They're looking for some sort of guidance when they get there. So today I'm going to talk about the components of a story, and then the kinds of stories that we love, the things that really, really resonate with consumers. So that ultimately we can fill in this huge gap with the components, which, as you know, are characters, settings, and actions. We all learned this in grade school. This isn't rocket science, but we so often forget how meaningful and valuable these things are. And unless you're a writer, unless you're somebody who tells stories for a living, you gloss over these components because they're invisible to you as a reader. You just fall in love with these stories. You fall in love with characters, right? But when it comes time to tell your own story, it's easy to forget. So let's talk about some characters. Heroes, mentors, you have a love interest, a sidekick, a villain. In beer, we have founders and brewers and consumers. You have your staff, you have collaborators. The media is part of that story. In settings, things like Hogwarts, Oz, even New York City and fake New York City, right? You get things like Gotham. Like, these are places that we can picture in our heads just at the mention of the word. So in beer, we have these other really exciting places that are often presented sort of matter-of-factly. Breweries, tap rooms, even farms, maybe the local city that you're involved in, maybe you're on the road as a gypsy brewer, bars and restaurants. These are all settings where your story comes to life. And then actions. We all know that the most compelling story is something happens, right? If you're watching Game of Thrones for the past month, something's finally happening. Fighting evil, conquering a city, discovering gold, saving a life, building an ark. These are things that major characters do. Examples in beer can be exciting. They could also be kind of boring sometimes, depending on how it's presented or the context that it's in. You're releasing new beers, you're at festivals, you're at tap takeovers, brew days, conferences, competitions. Hiring and firings are actions. These can matter to your consumer. I think beer makers probably take more action in their marketplace in front of the consumer than just about any other industry I've ever worked in. It's a very tangible, hand-to-hand, competitive, and collaborative, and it's in front of your consumer all the time, right? That's one of craft beer's biggest stories, is that you know who makes your beer. So you probably already do a lot of these things. You have to in order to be a brewer in this country. You have to be doing these things. You have to have these people involved. But not everybody strings that together into a narrative that really matters or resonates with anybody. So while you might have these kind of pieces in place in the middle, not a lot of people are asking, what kind of story do you want to tell, which is potentially the most fundamentally important thing you can ask yourself. And then ultimately, what's the moral of your story? What do you want that takeaway to be? There's a lot of different kinds of stories at our disposal. And you can use these as sort of a framework to think about what kind of stories make sense for who you are as brewers, as people, as a business, as a community member. Good and evil, love stories, adventure, mystery, gonzo. Beer does this too. We've been doing it at sort of the global level for a long time, right? Good versus evil, fighting the macros. Like everybody alive in the 90s remembers that story well. A love story. Maybe you're obsessed with hops. Maybe that's who you are as a brewery. Maybe the obsession story is what got you famous. Maybe there's an adventure story happening right now, I think, around kind of taming the American wild ale, or like people are going after this sort of new frontier in yeast development. Mystery, the dark arts of barrel aging, is becoming a major narrative for craft beer. And then gonzo, the gypsy brewers all over the globe, people who are traveling around, having adventures, meeting new people, and kind of telling this weird sort of, interspersed story along the way. So these stories are out there. They're happening at a macro level. Not a lot of brewers really think about where they fit in or what kind of story makes sense for them on a particular level. And then ultimately, the moral of the story. What do you want us to take away from this? Like, should we be interested in your outlook on life? Is there more to beer than just beer? Are there riches to be found? Is there some sort of lesson that we need to take away from knowing about who you are as a brewer? And if you think that quality is the only thing you want people to take away, realize how few people in their life ever read Ulysses. We're not attracted to quality in and of itself. We're attracted to quality as a component of a much bigger story. If this was the only thing that mattered, we would all be highly familiar with Ulysses. I've tried to read it 7 times in my literature studies as an undergraduate, and I got maybe a quarter of the way every single time. It's just not the most exciting thing for me. Moby Dick, front to back, multiple times. Things happen. I fall in love with those characters. So how do we tell our story? Right? We're talking about the what. What kind of story do we want to tell? What do we want that moral to be? But then ultimately, how do we want to tell that story is just as important. This is what I see still when a lot of breweries try to tell stories. National Donut Day is apparently a very appealing narrative thread in the world of brewing. For about 2 days straight, my entire Facebook feed, for what I do, I follow a lot of Facebook accounts for breweries, and this is all I saw. It was amazing. There's something very, very attractive about this. But the one voice that stood out in the wilderness for me was this guy, who just said, "Fuck National Donut Day," right? If there was anybody that was going to make a dent on National Donut Day, it should have been this guy. But beyond just the aesthetics or the value of storytelling in something like National Donut Day, I think what people miss is that everybody else is going to have the same idea if you're reacting to what's going on around you rather than trying to invest your story into the rest of the world, right? If National Donut Day is happening, we need to be a part of it, we need to do something. I guarantee everybody else is thinking that too. But if you have an internalized story that you want to tell that's unique to you, it's going to look different every single time. And it's not just the aesthetics of this that really bother me. I mean, I can get over that. It's National Donut Day. Who cares, really? What bothers me is that when I see a grid like this, I think of all of the time and the hours and the money that went into brand managers and people approving things and people dealing with comment threads on Facebook. This is an enormous investment in the brewing world for National Donut Day, and it doesn't matter. Yeah, so fuck National Donut Day. So why do we do that? Well, it's because we have all of these new tools to tell our stories now. We used to rely on the media to tell our stories, right? We would talk to a reporter, they'd get the background, they would summarize it in some compelling way, and it would go out to the world. Now we have to do it all, and we have to do it with a million different tools. And so we end up developing this compulsion to use these tools. They're there, there are people there, we need to be there, and so we have to use them. But tools aren't strategies. This is one of the biggest lessons I learned in storytelling, was that tools are not strategies. We don't have a hammer strategy. We don't have pencil strategies or Microsoft Word strategies. These are things that we can use as tools to complete our missions, but they're not the thing in and of itself. Nobody's sitting around all day with a hammer saying, I gotta hit something, I've gotta hit something, right? Twitter's also not a strategy. At best, if you're using these things in the wrong way, using tools as strategies, you might get some recognition. You might get people who have said, oh, I think I've heard of that. I saw that large pink bottle on National Donut Day. I think I've seen that before. That's the best you can kind of hope for from that. If you get really good at it and you start sharing interesting content, you've got somebody who kind of knows how to game that system, they know how to engage audiences, still not connected to a big story, but they know how to use those tools in a compelling way, you might get something of resonance, right? I'm into what these guys are doing. If I'm somebody on National Donut Day that makes donuts, I'm just like, yes! Like, this is the biggest day of the year for me in beer. You could get resonance. You can obtain that. And the reason for that is because while we used to read the New York Times or we would watch CNN, we use social media, right? These people are coming together. This isn't news to anybody now. We know that that interaction creates an engagement where otherwise there isn't even anything compelling to talk about. Somehow the engagement enough can help people understand that something resonates. And that's because as consumers, we use these tools to curate our own lives. It's not that you're doing anything compelling by using these tools. In most cases, breweries are not. But if it connects with something that I'm using those tools for, we overlap. We find an intersection point. Whether we're collecting things on Instagram that tell our life story and your bottles show up there, creates impressions, great. You get some numbers out of that or some eyeballs. Pinterest, Spotify, the music that we curate or the beers that we log are telling a little bit of a story about us as individuals, as consumers. And all that really ultimately means is that you're playing into our narrative. When you're using these social tools as a strategy and it doesn't have anything bigger behind it, the best you can hope for is that you can resonate with me. It doesn't tell me anything compelling about you. And the questions you ask when you're doing using these kinds of tools is, are we discoverable? And are we doing anything worth sharing? For me, this is sort of like the minimum bar that you've got to hit to even be using these things at all. People who are doing this exceptionally well, in my mind, are using these social media tools even without necessarily having a perfect narrative or a perfect kind of brand story built behind it, are showing people and places and activities, all those things we talked about that make up what a story is. There's characters, there's actions, there's a setting. And for me as a consumer, I'm at least able to stitch this together into my own head to make up the story that I think about that brewery. This is Solemn Oath here in Naperville, Illinois. And I think they do a great job of showing through these visuals and these little tiny bits of pieces of stories what's going on with them. They didn't post anything on National Donut Day. And they connect it with their website. So you can see that the way that they share images on the website looks like the way they share images on Facebook. It's starting to be consistent, right? Consistency is like this minimum barrier you need in order to get people to even recognize you when next time they see a picture on Facebook. I think Penrose does a pretty good job. They're out here in Geneva, Illinois. I can tell, and I've kind of learned this about them over time, that these people love beer and they love food, and it shows. And they've also started to show the people and the faces behind their brewery as well. And they have a very consistent aesthetic and a very consistent way in which they share this information, and it's starting to build this little bit of a narrative over time about where they think beer fits into our lives and how it should be enjoyed. So that's great. That gets us to resonance. That helps me as a consumer figure out, I'm kind of into what these guys are doing. How do we get to holy shit? How do we get to a place where we surprise somebody, we make them stop for a minute? How do we get to a revelation? To do this, I wanted to illustrate with an example that I thought would be really, really weird for this audience. Mostly, I believe this to be true because it was really weird for me. A$AP Rocky, I'm probably not even pronouncing that right, there's a $ in his name. A rapper, a really well-known rapper in the industry. Young guy, this is what his Instagram feed looked like for months and months, hyping up his album, very sort of processed, produced shots. Like, this doesn't look like Instagram, most people's Instagram, right? This is obviously a very commercial tool that he's using. He's using it in a very commercial way. He had about 1.6 million followers. It's kind of a big deal. And then he kind of had this weird idea. His Instagram started looking like this. He stripped it all back, stripped away all of the hype, wasn't just talking about his album, wasn't just showing new concerts and things like that. He wasn't just broadcasting anymore. He decided to take a pretty big risk. Now, anybody who knows how Instagram works knows that in order to create a grid of images like this, he had to upload 8 gray squares, well, mostly gray. That one has a little splash of white in it on the bottom left, and then one image. And he had to do it in the right time, so it created the right grid. And the only way you would ever see this grid is if you actually clicked over to his account to see everything as it's perfectly presented. Otherwise, your feed was just a bunch of whites or gray or black squares. And then he started introducing other sort of mosaics into the feed. He started creating a little bit of a narrative that talked about childhood, his life, who he is as a person now, and why he creates what he creates. He started to develop iconography that communicated those things as well. And again, more and more black squares. He lost 100,000 followers in a single day. And the biggest reason for that is because people just saw all this junk going into their feed, and it didn't resonate with them. He wasn't telling a story about their world, he was telling a story about his world. And in order to be curious about that, you had to click over to his account to see something that looked like this. You had to be invested, you had to care, you had to be curious. And that meant that he was making a big choice. He was risking something artistically. He was willing to risk 100,000 followers. Maybe, I don't know if he really thought that would happen. Maybe that surprised the hell out of him and he got scared, but he did it anyway. But he risked 100,000 followers in order to do something more important. He awed the nation for a week. Every music outlet wrote about this. Every Thrillist sort of site out there wrote about this. Everybody was talking about how he lost 100,000 followers in a day. He got those 100,000 followers back by the end of that day. And those were people who were interested in what he was doing as an artist. And those are people that when they see a white square the next time he shares it, are probably going to click over to see what he's doing with that white square. So for me, that's the power of somebody who's willing to not pander to the medium, to not pander to the audience, to show them something truly special in his mind, and find the people who actually care about what he's doing. And the insight for me there was that we are still susceptible to awe. As somebody who deals with a lot of brand managers and marketing managers, I hear a lot about who millennials are and how to engage them, how to have a conversation with them. And mostly what I hear is pandering. Oh, they love selfies. Let's put a little spot in the room where they could take a selfie when they come to my event. Right? We pander to them. We treat them like tiny little puppies or something that are just going to follow us around as long as we show them, like, oh, this is the thing you like over here. What this guy shows me is that we're still susceptible to awe. You can violate the expectations of that person and show them something bigger and more interesting. There was an article that came out in the New York Times recently about awe and what it really means to us as a people. And this is the part that really struck me, was that awe imbues people with a different sense of themselves, one that is smaller, more humble, and part of something larger. As an audience member, I love it when somebody shows me that there is awe to be had. That it's not just about you showing me something on Instagram or Facebook that's interesting or maybe resonates with me, or I like donuts and you're showing me donuts, right? This kind of minimal viable interaction. We can show people something bigger. We can be part of the story as storytellers. That it's not just about the audience, it's about the story. So here's a few examples for me that I've worked on in the past couple of years. Central State. 3 guys in Indianapolis. One was a competent brewer at Flat 12. The other one was a competent home brewer over years of study, been working with yeast, specifically Brettanomyces. And a friend of theirs, and Jake, who'd become sort of an accomplished event producer, beer writer. They wanted to start their own brewery. And they wanted to do an all 100% Brettanomyces brewery in Indianapolis. They thought it was crazy. They didn't care. They were going to go for it. They didn't know what that meant in terms of how that was going to play out. So I went to work with them, drove down to Indianapolis, which they were surprised when they said that they wanted help developing their brand. They thought we were just going to work up some visual comps and email them to them, I think. But when we showed up in Indianapolis and we went out to the bar with them, we went to restaurants, we partied a little bit, we had a good time, we met their families. I started to learn about who these guys really were and why they liked what they liked, right? Why they were going to do what they were going to do. And it's because they were interested not in sort of violating what people thought of Indianapolis. They weren't interested in elevating themselves above what that city could do in terms of beer. They wanted to increase the value of Indianapolis in all of our eyes. People who don't know Indy, people who don't know that there's an artisanal food movement there, that there are third-wave coffee shops, that there are brewers who want to do something special. And that led us to realize that we needed to tell a story about these guys and who was already there, who they were friends with, the kinds of places they ate, the kinds of places they drank. And that led us to this aha moment when we realized how obsessed they were with the Midwest, as it historically was. We're missing a word here. I think one of the fonts is off, but the phrase there is a Midwest exotic. And that became sort of a rally cry for us. Because by going down there and hanging out with them and partying with them and meeting their families and their friends, I realized that the one guy does like weird battle reenactment stuff, right? He's like really into like the French and Indian War, I think. The other guy was kind of obsessed with the history of the town. He could tell you about specific buildings, what kind of businesses went in there. Like this was like nerdy stuff for him, and he was really shy to talk about it at first. Once he realized this was interesting, potentially played a story into who they were as people, man, the whole thing just kind of came pouring out of them. And I walked away from this brewery realizing that I didn't have to sell this weird brewery in Indianapolis. We were selling Indianapolis. We were selling the Midwest to the rest of the country. And that completely changed, I think, where the emphasis of the story began with Once Upon a Time. It didn't begin at the end with, look at this 100% Brett beer, that's kind of weird, right? It began with, we are 3 guys from Indianapolis who love Indianapolis, and this is the story we want to tell about it. And that translates to the packaging. We use historical images. On some of the more wild beers, we kind of created these beautiful, colorful sort of swirls of things to kind of show people not only what's going on inside the bottle, but kind of what's going on inside the heart of the Midwest. It's a Midwest exotic. And it's hard to read on the screen here, but on top of that box it says, "In Brett we trust," right? It has this sort of like rally cry to it. It has this kind of Midwestern kind of like colonial kind of quality, Civil War kind of feel to it. This kind of thinking or this kind of tone was embodied by these 3 guys. And then, just to make sure that everybody was confused when they go to their website, this is what you see. You don't see guys just trying to sell their beers or show you their cool logos or anything like that. You see another guy who's a friend of theirs writing about Brettanomyces, not only the state of it and the history of it, but what they're trying to do with it on a scientific level. And so they're making this like really huge, memorable impact when you go there. You don't go there and just see, hey, cool beer. You go there and you'll be like, oh, these guys are working on something. They're trying to do something. Like there's ambition in this. Another one, Solemn Oath here in Naperville. 3 years old, growing rapidly. They've kind of become famous for this thing they do every year to celebrate their anniversary, which is Oath Day. Oath Day for me is a really bizarre, successful concept. They don't do, it's not, it's kind of, a lot of people talk about it as like Dark Lord Light, right? But it's not that at all because they don't even do a beer release and they still sell thousands of tickets. What they're celebrating is their role in the town and the people around them who love beer and the people around them who love the kind of culture that they're building. And that's all embodied for me in this very tiny phrase that I think just showed up in a sketch one day when their artist, Jordan Gullett, was working on a new can illustration or something like a koozie or these hats and things that he was working on. I just kept seeing this word Naperthrill. If you didn't catch where they're from Naperville. It's a very conservative, affluent suburb in Chicago, about an hour away. And they've transformed that phrase into Naperthrill, right? And that communicates to the consumer, like, we're going to bring you something fun and exciting, and that's what we're about. that they wanted to build a culture before they ever built a beer culture. And this is what Oath Day looks like. To me, this is one of the most exciting places to be in beer every year. I haven't missed one yet. There are games, there are people that drive up motorcycles and park them and just you walk around and you look at them, you look like they're hot rods. There are people that showed up with vans this year, just so you could kind of see this like weird, quirky van culture. They were friends of the artist and he just invited them in. They just started inviting these people in that seemed to resonate with who they were. Emporium dragged a bunch of arcade games out there so people could have a good time just hanging out in the parking lot. And of course, people drank a ton of beer. But the beer wasn't the whole reason they were there. They weren't there just to get this bottle that they could put on eBay and start to sell for twice as much and get a bunch of status out of it and show it on Facebook and Instagram. People were there to have a good time with each other and to have a good time with the people behind the brewery. Because as I showed you earlier, when they share stuff on social media, they show you the people. They show you what they do. They show you what kind of lives they lead. And then you get to take part in that once a year at Oath Day. For me, this gets embodied, I think, in the way they even go to other markets. So this is their Wisconsin launch. We decided that we were going to take this Naper Thrill idea and go to Wisconsin and show them kind of how they embody this lifestyle. You know what I'm like, 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 you play it in your system every night. You know what I'm like, 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 you play it in your system every night. Again, even when they go to another market, you're seeing the people, you're seeing the places, you're seeing the way they like to hang out and have fun. And then, of course, beer becomes part of that. But you can see that they're bringing that with them on the road. That's how you get to something like holy shit, right? When you come in and sell a beer into Wisconsin, very few people come to it with a culture like this behind it. They usually come in, they host some tap takeovers, some beer dinners, things like that. They don't come and make a rap video with you, right? It's a completely different kind of loyalty you get out of a story like that. Five Rabbit. Started in Chicago, again, I think about 3 years ago now, a little more. Latino-inspired brewing, Latin-inspired brewing. They were bringing exotic ingredients, like sort of mythology stories from Latin America with them. Five Vulture, Five Rabbit, Five Lizard. And they were doing well in the market. They were selling a lot of beer. They were getting some praise for the recipes that they were producing. Randy Mosher was behind a lot of those, so he became a big part of the face of that brewery. But then I was there taking pictures one day and I saw this. And it was very different than anything I'd ever seen them present to the world before. And when I asked about it, they said, oh, this was just something that one of the guys on the packaging line scribbled one day. It's kind of like how it's kind of like the street art style of Mexico City. And I thought this was one of the coolest things I'd ever seen them do. Right? These other things were beautiful. This was cool. This told me a very different story than just what the story that they were hoping was translating in the bottle. So we started working together to figure out if the beers they'd been producing now, which they'd become known for, what was to the left of those? What was to the right of those? What if that wasn't the whole portfolio? What if that was just part of it? And that's how we ended up talking about what the story was. Everything was happening at the end. Nobody knew what Once Upon a Time was. And so we came up with this series called Gringolandia, where they could make very American-inspired beers, but with a really fun story wrapped around it. Gringolandia is what they refer to as the US, if you're from Mexico or Costa Rica. And it's sort of a term of endearment that they all have. And they're able to start telling that story of where they're from just through the name of that. And then the artwork changed. It became less about Aztec myths and more about myths of Mexico City, right now. Super Pills, Fabulosa Porter. These were names that people loved saying out loud. La Loteria became a series based on these cards that are really famous as sort of like a bingo game in South America. These became some of their high-end single-barrel offerings, these funny little illustrations that told the story about where they were from and the kind of myths that they tell each other even today. Paletas. Rather than doing something really big, high ABV, these guys can be famous doing a very low ABV, sort of Radler-esque juiced kind of beer based on this sort of street culture of the paletas, the popsicles, the fruity popsicles that are around. They even got one of these carts and started wheeling it around as a tap system at events. And then finally, Yoto Con leche, I think, is the best example of how story creates a completely different perception of a product. Yoto Con leche, it's an imperial porter with con leche in it for that kind of lactose vibe with coffee, Costa Rican coffee specifically, but nobody really knew that. And if you knew it, great. If you didn't know it, you'd never care. It just tastes like a good coffee porter. This is what became of con leche when we decided to go to Costa Rica. Go ahead. When we decided to go to Costa Rica to source the coffee this time. get the idea. It's a very different looking story around con leche than just a bottle on a shelf. This is what the hashtag Yoto Con leche used to look like on Instagram before we went down to Costa Rica to source the coffee ourselves. And now that we've started telling the story along with our consumers, this is what it looks like. It's a fundamentally different understanding of what that beer on a shelf is really about. And the last one, this will only take a moment, Goose Island. We embarked on a big storytelling project this year around Bourbon County Stout, because this was the story that was being told about Bourbon County Stout for way too long. This is the product they're trying to sell. It's beautiful, it's stoic, austere, but those lines were telling a much bigger story and drowning it out. So we decided to hit the road and dig a little deeper. The background of Bourbon County Stout. How far back does this story go? Well, obviously there's a barrel that you can follow. We went to Louisville, we went to Heaven Hill, we found the people who were making it, storing it in the rick houses, tasting it, conditioning it. We found the people who were making the barrels themselves in Missouri and Louisville. And this is how far back it went. We're in the middle of the Ozarks taking down white oak trees. This is just a tease of what we're going to be talking about much later in the fall, I think, when we sort of release this story in video format. But this, for me, was a way to tell a story that had nothing to do with you at all. It had everything to do with the amount of people and the places and what they produce that goes into that. It takes 100 years to grow a white oak tree. Bourbon sits in those barrels for 10, 15, 25 years, and then a beer sits in it for a year or so. Nobody alive taking down a white oak tree that ended up as a bourbon barrel with that beer in it is alive. That's how deep a story like that can go, and that's how compelling something like Bourbon County Stout as a product can be when you ask yourself, not what is at the end of this, what do I have to fit on that label, but what's once upon a time, and then who are the characters and the places and the actions involved. So here's my takeaway. When you're thinking about your story, first of all, don't take it for granted. Don't think that everybody knows it, and don't think that people won't care. Be your own fan. When I was on the road with Sierra Nevada Beer Camp, the bus tour this year, I rode from Flagstaff to Chicago with those guys. One of the best experiences I've ever had in beer in my life. Being in the back with the wind in our hair and a Lost Abbey box set in front of us, music in our ears. We stopped in the Grand Canyon. We went down whitewater rafting in the Colorado. A Men's Journal asked me to write a story about that, and I did. When they got it, they said, why'd you give us a story about the Grand Canyon? I was like, well, this is the story of the trip. Like, this is what these guys are doing. This is going to be one of the greatest memories of any of these guys' lives. And they said, oh, no. We talk about the Grand Canyon in the travel section. We want the top 10 beers from Arizona. You have to tell your own story. The media can't do that for you. You have to be your biggest fan. Bring your friends and your audience along on that journey. Show them what it's like. Get them in there. Tell the story with commitment, right? National Donut Day takes 0 commitment. Tell your story with commitment. Use whatever tools you have. You don't have a Twitter strategy. You don't have a Facebook strategy. You have tools at your disposal to tell the story that's worth telling. And then finally, make a great beer that embodies that story. Thank you.
We got time for a couple questions, but I mean,
Yes.
Clearly a lot of interesting points made. I guess, what are the top 3 questions? You said that, when you visit these guys, you learn about their families, you see the places they eat, you go out, you drink with them. So when you sit down with a client, what are the top 3 questions that you're asking them to help learn how to tell their story?
Well, I think it makes them really nervous that I don't ask a lot of questions at first at all. They're just like, why? So here's where we like to eat. Why are we here? They start asking me questions because they start to get anxious because they expect me to come in as like a consultant and just start addressing problems, right, or figuring out what they should be doing. But rather than that, we spend half a day to most of a day together, and at the end of that, I tell them what I see. I was like, I see you guys caring about these things. I see the way you're engaging with these kinds of restaurant owners or chefs or other beer buyers at restaurants. Here's how you've been talking about beer. Here's what your story sounds like to me. And here are all the things that I think are behind it. Right. And that's when it becomes a little bit of an aha. That's when we just roll out a piece of butcher paper and start drawing on it, start writing down phrases and keywords and things like that. It gets really immersive. Because if I were to start asking them questions right away, they would just be telling me the answers they think I want to hear.
Right. So if you're not asking questions and you're someone who maybe can't afford Michael Kiser and to have him come out to their brewery and spend a week with them, travel into Wisconsin and shooting amazing photographs and videos.
Fun. That was done on the cheap, but yeah.
Well, I mean, if you're looking to sort of do a hack internally,
Yeah.
To figure out a way to better tell your story, what's some
And
advice?
especially if you're a small brewery, I think finding somebody that you have internally that has a passion for this kind of stuff, for storytelling, maybe they're just great at taking photos, maybe they make videos on their own time, maybe they love writing, give them a chance to start telling the story and let it come from their point of view for a while and see what happens. I mean, stories that are told from a specific narrator's voice tend to be the most memorable, right? Because they're not getting washed out and genericized by this sort of like corporate kind of feeling, oh, we shouldn't say that word, we should say this word. Mistakes are part of stories, right? Let those guys tell a story for a little while and see what happens. You might find that there's something rich there. You might find that somebody's really great at it. But I think the easiest piece of advice I can give is just take a camera with you everywhere you go. You've already got one in your pocket on your phone. Use it to the best of your capabilities, and then just use those tools to get it out. But just don't pay attention to the quality of the image you're getting. Pay attention to what you're taking a picture of, who you're engaging with during those stories. Those are things that build up over time.
Awesome. Michael, thank you.
My pleasure.
Cheers.
Thanks for having me.